I remember the exact moment my father's death cracked the world open, and I found that old cedar box his trembling hands had hidden in plain sight, with a note in his handwriting that simply said, "Do not trust them. Save yourself." By then, I had already poured my entire $90,000 factory pension into a patented composting system that my brother-in-law stole right out from under me with a forged signature. But by the time I was done, I owned the company outright, collected half the royalties, and every donation check I mailed to a forgery detection nonprofit listed him as Inspirational Fraudster of the Year. My name is Lillian Vance, and I spent 27 years on the line at a precision engine parts plant in Toledo, Ohio, a place where the air always smelled of cutting fluid, and the concrete floor was worn smooth by 1,000 pairs of steel-toed boots. I worked as a quality control inspector, the last set of eyes before a batch of valve stems or camshaft bearings shipped out, and my entire job was noticing things that were off. A burr the width of a cat whisker, a microfracture that only glinted under a certain angle of light. I carried that discipline into every corner of my life, including the habit of signing my name on every inspection log, every work order, with a fountain pen loaded with Noodler's legal blue ink, a deep indigo that oxidized to a unique shade no photocopier could perfectly replicate. That obsession with detail, and a skill I picked up fixing the locker room padlocks when maintenance went on strike in 04, turned out to be the very thing that saved me from a betrayal so precise it might as well have been engineered on a drafting table. I never imagined I would end up inside a federal patent fraud investigation, but life has a way of turning a quality control inspector into a forensic accountant when you least expect it. My younger sister Karen was the golden child, the one my late mother adored and dressed in lace collars, while I wore hand-me-down corduroys. She married a man named Mark Rifkin, who had a smile that never reached his eyes and an MBA he leveraged like a weapon. My father, a retired civil engineer who measured everything twice and kept a set of carbide scribes in his shirt pocket until the day he died, was the quiet architect of our family's stability. He was the one who stood in his garage with Mark and me 3 years earlier, sketching a rotating drum on a piece of graph paper, the three of us brainstorming an in-vessel composting system that could process organic waste faster and cleaner than anything the city had ever used. Mark brought the business jargon. I brought 27 years of understanding how rotary bearings, forced-air manifolds, and temperature tolerances actually worked. Dad brought the structural steel and the hydraulics. We sealed the partnership on a handshake in that garage, a 50-50 deal, and I liquidated my entire $90,000 pension to fund the prototyping and patent filing. Dad co-signed the provisional patent application with us, dated and witnessed by his bridge partner Laura Benson, a retired intellectual property attorney who had agreed to help us navigate the filing as a friendly favor. I thought we were building a legacy. Instead, I was funding the trap that would eventually snap shut on me. Dad's heart gave out on a Tuesday evening in late September, a massive coronary that dropped him right on his own front porch while he was reaching for the mail. The neighbor found him, and by the time I got the call, standing in my small apartment kitchen with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, the world had already tilted. The funeral was a blur of cheap carnations and distant relatives, but what I remember most vividly is the way Karen and Mark moved through Dad's house 48 hours later like a pair of corporate liquidators. They weren't there to mourn. They were there to manage. Karen had always been the one who got new sedans while I took the bus, and Mark drove a leased German sedan that he polished every Sunday morning with a microfiber cloth, even in the rain. I watched my sister sweep Dad's belongings into black contractor bags with a flick of her manicured wrist, as if his whole life was just clutter in her way. A drafting compass, a slide rule yellowed with age, a leather-bound notebook full of pressure calculations. One of the items she grabbed without even looking was a small cedar box with worn brass hinges and the faint scent of the machine oil Dad used to wipe down his tools. Karen cracked it open, saw a few rusted screws, a couple of dull drill bits and a stained shop rag, and she tossed it straight into the trash bag headed for the curb with a disgusted sigh. She said, "Honestly, who keeps this junk?" and then went back to sorting his clothes into donation piles. I said nothing. I just cataloged the movement, the way my quality control brain always did, and filed it away. An hour later, when Karen and Mark announced they were going out for overpriced lattes and some fresh air, I drifted back into the living room like a ghost in my own family's house. The black bag sat by the garage door, the lip of it folded over, and I could see the cedar box's corner poking through a tear. I pulled it free, wiped off the wet coffee grounds and a smear of something greasy, and carried it to my old childhood bedroom, where the wallpaper was still peeling in the corner and the single window looked out on a dying maple tree. My hands were steady, but my stomach was a knot. That box had been on Dad's workbench for 30 years, and I knew as far back as I could remember that it held more than just rusty screws. He'd shown me the false bottom once when I was 12, a trick he'd built into the box to hide a small stash of emergency cash from my mother, who had a way of spending every dollar she found. I sat on the edge of the creaky bed, pried the false bottom loose with a butter knife from the kitchen, and there it was. A yellowed envelope, a tiny brass key no bigger than my thumbnail, and a single sheet of graph paper folded into a tight square. On the graph paper, in Dad's unmistakable architectural lettering, all sharp angles and precise strokes, were 7 words. Do not trust them. Save yourself. Below that, he'd added a smaller line in pencil. Lockbox 441, First Ohio Trust. Use if I'm gone before you. I see what he's doing. I pressed that little brass key into my palm until the teeth left red marks, and in that moment the whole house felt like it was holding its breath. Ceiling creaked, but it was just the wind. I slipped the envelope and key into my coat pocket and knew, with a sick clarity, that the real battle had not even started. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that some people will try to steal everything you've built, and you have to be ready to fight back. The vultures came at me within a week. Mark sat me down at his kitchen island, a slab of dark gray granite cold as a morgue table, and slid a thick stack of documents across the surface with the finesse of a car salesman closing a deal. Karen hovered behind him, twisting a diamond tennis bracelet around her wrist, the same bracelet I later found out he'd bought on credit, the same week Dad's pension account was frozen. The papers were dense with legalese, a durable power of attorney giving them control of all my financial affairs, a quitclaim deed for Dad's house that transferred it into a trust they controlled, and a document titled Mutual Release and Assignment of Partnership Interests that purported to restructure our composting venture to streamline operations. Mark explained, in a voice as smooth as buttercream frosting, that I needed to let them handle all the complicated affairs while I grieved. He talked about how I should rest and not burden myself, how they had my best interests at heart, how this was just temporary until I felt stronger. Karen chimed in, her voice dripping with a thick syrup of false sympathy, saying she just wanted to take care of me like a big sister should, even though she was 2 years younger. Each sentence was a padded manacle. I didn't refuse. I didn't argue. I played the part of a foggy, exhausted widow of life, the woman whose pension was gone and whose partner in invention had just died. I let my hands tremble on purpose, let my voice crack when I said I needed to think, couldn't quite focus on all the words. I watched their faces. Mark's jaw tightened microscopically when I said I'd sleep on it, a tiny flare of the masseter muscle that betrayed his impatience. Karen's smile turned plastic, the way a department store mannequin smiles. I nodded slowly, saying I'd look things over when my head cleared. That night, while I was still sitting in the guest chair nursing a cup of tea, Karen floated the suggestion as if it were an afterthought. You know, Lily, why don't you come stay in our spare bedroom for a while, just until you feel steady again? It's so empty here, and we'd worry about you all alone in that apartment. I knew it wasn't care. It was control. A way to keep me under their roof, where they could monitor my every move and apply pressure daily. But I also knew that the cedar box and the tiny brass key were in my coat pocket, and something told me I needed to be inside their house to uncover whatever Dad had seen. So I packed my things the next morning, a single worn suitcase and a tool bag with my screwdrivers and calipers, and I moved into the lion's den. Living in their house was like being a mouse in a gallery of cats, except I was a mouse with decades of experience spotting tiny fractures. Mark had a home office on the first floor, a room with a deadbolt lock and a window that faced the street, and Karen treated me like a mildly inconvenient houseplant that needed watering but no actual conversation. I began to notice the rhythms of their panic. Mark would take frantic phone calls in the garage, the door barely closed, and I'd hear him hiss phrases like the filing deadline, and the city council vote is next Thursday. I need the papers by Monday. He'd pace the hallway at midnight in his slippers, talking low into his cell phone about the LLC structure and the royalty triggers on the patent. Meanwhile, Karen was ordering deliveries almost daily. A commercial-grade espresso machine in brushed nickel, a set of designer luggage that still had the price tags hanging off the handles, a pair of leather wingback chairs that probably cost more than my first car. The FedEx truck was a regular visitor. It didn't match the supposedly tight finances they kept mentioning over dinner, the way Karen would sigh about cutting back while scrolling through an online boutique. One afternoon, while Karen was wrestling with a jammed filing cabinet in the hallway alcove just outside the kitchen, I offered to take a look. The drawer was an old steel case model, the kind with a central locking bar that engaged 3 sides, and it had been forced so many times that the slide mechanism was bent. I walked over with a tiny flathead screwdriver I kept in my bag, the same one I used to adjust the tension on air gauge fixtures at the plant. I crouched down, slid the screwdriver into the gap between the drawer and the frame, and felt for the locking bar's release tab. I'd done this 100 times on jammed locker doors during the maintenance strike, and within about 30 seconds I had the bar bypassed and the drawer sliding free. Karen stared at me like I'd just levitated. She said, "How on earth did you do that?" I just shrugged and said, "Old habits from the factory. You learn a few tricks." I smiled, but inside I was cataloging. The filing cabinet had a wafer lock that was easy to rake, and now I knew exactly where the sensitive documents were stored. She didn't realize I just mapped the entire mechanical security of their house in one casual, helpful moment. From that point on, I was a student of their habits. The house had a rhythm. Every Tuesday morning, Karen went to a 90-minute hot yoga class at a studio across town, and every Thursday afternoon, Mark had a standing golf game that kept him away for at least 4 hours. I started with their trash. Not the kitchen bin, which was too messy, but the small paper shredder they kept in the corner of the home office. Mark would empty the shredder basket into a white kitchen bag every Sunday night and drop it in the garage bin. On Monday mornings, before the garbage truck came, I'd slip out at dawn, pull that bag from the bin, and carry it into my small guest room. There, on the floor, I'd lay out a clean white sheet, dump the shreds, and begin the painstaking process of reconstruction. 27 years of quality control inspection teaches you to sort by color, by paperweight, by edge pattern. I used a roll of matte Scotch tape and transparency film from an old presentation binder I found in the hall closet, and I'd spend hours, sometimes in the gray light of early morning, aligning the little paper teeth back together. It was a jigsaw puzzle of greed. The first complete document I pieced together was a draft of a contract between the City of Sylvania's Waste Management Department and an entity called Green Cycle Solutions, LLC, a company I had never heard of. The contract was for the installation and maintenance of 12 in-vessel rotary bioreactors, our composting system, at a price of $600,000, with an option for annual renewal. The signatory line for the seller was Mark Rifkin, manager. No mention of me, no mention of our joint development. I kept piecing. Another document emerged. A filing receipt from the United States Patent and Trademark Office for a non-provisional utility patent application, serial number 17/583-291, titled Organic Waste Composting System with Automated Biofiltration, and the inventor was listed as Mark Rifkin alone. The receipt showed a filing date 3 weeks after Dad's death, but my blood truly chilled when I reassembled a torn page from an assignment document. It was a declaration and assignment of all rights that transferred my entire interest in the invention to Mark as sole assignee. My signature was on it, supposedly notarized by a Patricia Murrow on a date that fell right in the middle of my father's funeral week. The problem was, I had never signed anything in that entire period. I had never met Patricia Murrow, and the ink on the signature was a standard mass-produced ballpoint blue. I have always, for my entire adult life, signed official documents with a fountain pen loaded with Noodler's Legal Blue, a deep, slightly purplish indigo that oxidizes to a distinct shade over time. This forgery was done with a cheap office pen you could buy in a six-pack at any drugstore. I leaned in closer with a magnifying app on my phone and saw the telltale ballpoint skipping, the way the ink pooled at the start of each stroke. My own signature was always fluid, continuous lines without hesitation. I also noticed that the notary stamp's commission number was 14 digits, But Ohio notary commissions expire every 5 years, and the number format indicated a commission term that had ended 6 months before the date printed. A quick online search on the Ohio Secretary of State's notary database revealed that Patricia Murrow had indeed been a commissioned notary, but she had retired and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, the previous spring. Her commission was not active on the date stamp. I photographed every scrap with my phone, labeling each image by date and content. The next logical step was that lockbox Dad had mentioned. On a Thursday afternoon while Mark was on the golf course, I drove my old sedan to First Ohio Trust, a small brick building downtown with a polished brass door handle that felt cool in my palm. I gave the teller my identification and the tiny brass key, and after a brief verification, a young man in a blue blazer led me into a private room with rows of metal deposit boxes. He inserted the bank's guard key and my key simultaneously, turned them, and the narrow drawer slid out with a soft pneumatic hiss. Inside was a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax, the kind of thing I hadn't seen since my father sealed a letter to my mother on their anniversary. I signed the access log with my fountain pen, left my legal blue mark, and sat in that quiet room with the envelope in my hands for a full minute before I opened it. Inside were Dad's original witness notes, handwritten on his favorite heavy graph paper, dated 2 years prior. The notes detailed the meeting in his garage where we'd all agreed, in explicit terms, that the composting system was jointly invented by Lillian Vance and Mark Rifkin, 50-50 ownership, and that any transfer of rights required the live, notarized presence of both parties at the same bank on the same day. The notes were signed by all 3 of us, plus a witness signature from Laura Benson, the retired patents attorney. Dad included a photocopy of his own notes to himself, a note in the margin that said, "The handshake is legally binding in Ohio if witnessed and documented." Laura confirmed. He also included the certified filing receipt for the provisional patent application, listing Lillian Vance and Mark Rifkin as co-inventors, filed a full week before his heart attack. The receipt was stamped by the USPTO and carried the official serial number. Attached to the whole packet was a short letter in Dad's steady hand. "Lil, the provisional locks you in as co-inventor for 12 months. He can't get a sole non-provisional patent without your permission. If he tries, contact Laura Benson at the number below. She'll know what to do. The city's sustainability director already knows the system was developed by both of you. I made sure of it at the last Rotary lunch. Keep your chin up." I folded that letter and slid it into my inside coat pocket, right over my heart. I called Laura Benson that same afternoon from the parking lot of a public library where I knew Mark wouldn't think to look. She was living in a retirement community near the Maumee River, still sharp as a razor, and she agreed to meet me for coffee the next day. We sat in a corner booth at a diner, and she pulled up the USPTO records on a tablet while I nursed a cup of black coffee. She could still log in with her retired attorney credentials. The system confirmed that Mark had filed a non-provisional utility application claiming sole inventorship on the basis of that forged assignment. The application had already received a first office action allowance, meaning the patent examiner had found the claims patentable and was ready to issue the patent contingent on a few minor corrections. The city contract had been signed contingent on that patent issuing, which was why Mark was so frantic about deadlines. Laura explained in her calm, measured way that under 35 U.S.C. Section 115, false statements about inventorship were grounds to declare the patent unenforceable and could also trigger criminal penalties. The forgery made the assignment void ab initio, meaning it was legally worthless from the start. But she said I needed concrete physical evidence that the signature was fraudulent, beyond my word, ideally the original wet ink assignment document with the notary stamp so a forensic document examiner could confirm it. She also put me in touch with a contact at the USPTO Office of Enrollment and Discipline, and then, after a series of quiet phone calls, with a Detective Alina Ramos from the city's Procurement Integrity Unit. Detective Ramos was a compact woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense haircut and eyes that didn't miss much. We met at a park bench overlooking the river, and I gave her copies of everything I'd found. She listened, nodded, and then told me that Mark's LLC, Green Cycle Solutions, had already triggered a red flag because he had submitted a technical specification sheet with an embedded software algorithm for the biofilter's oxygenation rate that didn't match his academic background in business marketing. The algorithm was elegant and precise, based on differential pressure calculations across a porous membrane, and it had my initials, L.V., in the source code comments. It was directly derived from my years of reading airflow gauges and calibrating pressure transducers on the factory floor. Ramos said the city's IT auditor had flagged that discrepancy months ago, but lacked enough to act. With my evidence, she could build a case for fraud, but she needed the original forged assignment document with the fraudulent notary seal, and ideally Mark's LLC formation documents showing his exclusive control and the promissory note that she suspected existed. She asked if I could find and photograph those originals inside the house. I told her I could do one better. I could get copies of everything. That night, I began phase 2 of my quiet war. I knew the original assignment was in Mark's locked filing cabinet, the same one I'd already explored with Karen. I also knew the deadbolt on his office door was a standard Schlage 5-pin lock with no security pins, the kind I'd raked open a dozen times on locker room padlocks just to pass the time on break. I didn't have proper picks, but I had a tiny flathead screwdriver and a tension wrench made from the steel spine of a discarded hair clip I'd found in the guest bathroom, filed down to a narrow tip with a nail file. On a Friday night, Karen and Mark got dressed up for some charity gala that Karen insisted would raise their profile in the community. I gave them a wave from the guest room window and watched their taillights disappear around the corner. I waited 15 minutes, then slipped into the hallway. The deadbolt surrendered in 12 seconds with a gentle raking motion, the pins setting one by one like little mechanical sighs. Inside the office, the filing cabinet's wafer lock was even easier. A slight tension and a single sweep of the pick, and the drawer glided open. I found a folder labeled Patent Docs Final, and inside, the original assignment document with the wet ink forgery, a ballpoint blue that looked nothing like my legal blue. The notary stamp was crooked, the seal impression faint. I photographed every page, including a sticky note on the top that read, "Send to USPTO with substitute statement ASAP deadline 10/15. In Mark's handwriting. I also located the LLC operating agreement for Green Cycle Solutions, listing Mark as sole member with 100% ownership, and attached was a promissory note from a private lending firm in Florida, showing that Mark had already borrowed $300,000 against the expected city contract payment, using my forged signature as a personal guarantor. The loan documents even had a clause that if the contract fell through, the guarantor, me, would be personally liable for the full amount plus 22% annual interest. That meant he wasn't just stealing my invention, he was setting me up to be financially destroyed. I photographed every page, replaced everything as I'd found it, and closed the cabinet without a sound. I was back in my room, under the covers with my phone hidden in a hollowed-out book, within 45 minutes. I now had everything I needed, but Detective Ramos suggested we add one final piece to the puzzle, a documented demonstration of their cruelty and intent. She said that in fraud cases, showing that the perpetrators had no regard for the victim's life or well-being could turn a simple property crime into a much more serious charge, and it helped with sentencing. So we planned a controlled scenario. I told them I wanted to test whether a single shred of humanity remained in either of them. Ramos gave me a small digital voice recorder, slim as a stick of gum, and told me to keep it on my person. We settled on a staged medical collapse. A few days later, I put the plan into action. I had been feeling genuinely worn down by the stress and the constant performance of weakness, so it wasn't a stretch to fake a sudden episode. I waited until a Sunday afternoon when both Karen and Mark were home, lounging in the living room with the television murmuring about stocks. I was in the adjoining den, and I'd clipped the recorder inside my bra where the fabric held it snug against my ribs. I took a few deep breaths, let my knees buckle, and crumpled to the hardwood floor with a thud, making my body go limp, my jaw slack. I lay there, eyes almost closed, my breathing intentionally shallow and quick. I heard Karen's voice first. "Oh my God, what now?" She sounded more annoyed than alarmed. Her footsteps approached, but they stopped. Mark's voice cut through. "Is she breathing? Whatever, we'll call 911 in a minute. First, grab that folder on the table. The bank needs the notarized signature form for the severance account." And then I saw, through the slit of my nearly closed lids, Mark Rifkin's expensive leather loafer step right over my body. his heel grazing a strand of my hair as he reached for a manila folder on the coffee table. He actually stepped over what he thought was a dying woman to secure a piece of paper that was part of his scheme to defraud me. Karen hovered behind him, wringing her hands, and I heard her say, her voice tight and anxious, "Do you think she'll sign that release after this, or do we need to get a conservatorship? If she's incapacitated, we can just petition the court. That might be cleaner." No one checked my pulse. No one knelt beside me. They stood there discussing how to legally strip me of my rights while I lay motionless on the floor. I counted to 60, long enough for the recording to capture their words and the silence that followed, and then I let out a low moan and stirred, pretending to come to. Karen's tone immediately flipped to sickly sweet. "Oh, honey, you fainted. Stay still. We've got you." They called an ambulance, all performative concern now that they thought I might still be useful for a signature. I handed the recorder to Ramos the next day, and when she played it back in her office, I watched her face harden. She said, "These people are monsters." The confrontation was a symphony of timing. Detective Ramos coordinated with the USPTO investigator and a federal postal inspector because the forgery and wire fraud crossed state lines. They set up a meeting at the city's procurement office, in a conference room on the 4th floor with a view of the water treatment plant, under the pretense that Green Cycle Solutions needed a final wet signature from both co-inventors on a verification form required by the city's risk management department. Mark was so desperate to close the deal that he believed it without question. That morning, he loaded me into his spotless sedan, Karen in the back seat, and they both coached me on exactly what to say and do. "It's just a technicality, Lily," Mark said, his voice dripping with exaggerated patience. "The city needs both our signatures on a new form. Don't ask questions, just sign where the yellow sticky says. It's for the insurance binder. You want the system to launch, right?" Karen patted my hand from the back seat and said, "We're almost at the finish line, sweetie. Just let Mark handle the complicated parts." I nodded, slack-faced and compliant, while inside my chest, my heart was a steady, industrial rhythm. We arrived at the municipal building, a gray cube of government offices, and were escorted to a glass-walled conference room. A man named Mr. Crandall, a heavy-set city administrator with a kindly face, sat at the head of the table with a leather portfolio. He was actually coordinating with Ramos via a wireless earpiece, but Mark had no idea. Crandall made small talk about the weather, then slid a document across the polished table. It looked official, but it was a dummy form. A sticky yellow arrow pointed to a signature line. Mark uncapped a cheap ballpoint pen and pushed it toward me. I looked at the pen, then at the line, then at Mark. I saw the flicker of impatience behind his eyes. I saw Karen's manicured fingers twisting her bracelet again, and in that moment I let the mask slip. I straightened my spine, looked Mark Rifkin directly in the face, and said in a voice as clear and calm as a tolerance dial snapping into place, "I'm not signing my life away again." Mark's face froze, his mouth opening into a little O of confusion. Before he could form words, the conference room door swung open and Detective Ramos strode in with 2 uniformed officers and a woman in a navy blazer who identified herself as Special Agent Tran from the USPTO Enforcement Division. Crandall quietly gathered his portfolio and stepped out. Ramos placed the forged assignment document on the table, right next to my father's original joint development agreement from the lockbox, the USPTO provisional filing, and a notarized affidavit from the real Patricia Murrow in Arizona stating she had been in Scottsdale on the date in question, had never stamped that document, and that the commission number on the forgery was for a term that ended 6 months earlier. Ramos also displayed a certified forensic document examiner's report showing the signature was traced, with hesitation marks and inconsistent pressure, and that the ink was a standard ballpoint, not my known legal blue fountain pen ink. Mark started sputtering. "This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error my assistant must have." But the postal inspector cut him off, reading him his rights for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and filing false patent claims. Karen shrank back in her chair, her face the color of old milk, and started shrieking that she had nothing to do with the forgery. But Ramos produced a printed text message thread taken from Mark's phone with a warrant, where Karen had written, "Did you fix Lily's signature on that thing yet? We need the money. The lone guy called twice today." She was arrested as an accessory to fraud. The whole house of cards collapsed in less than 90 seconds, and I watched it happen with a calm that felt almost holy. In the aftermath, the legal system ground forward like the machines I used to calibrate. The USPTO declared Mark's assignment void and struck his sole inventorship claim, correcting the official records to list both of us as co-inventors. However, because of his criminal conviction, the federal district court ordered his interest in the patent and the LLC forfeited as restitution directly to me. I was granted full ownership of Green Cycle Solutions, LLC, by court order, and I immediately filed a continuation patent application with myself as sole legal owner, incorporating all my original technical contributions that had been stolen. The city contract was renegotiated directly with me, and the director of sustainability, a woman who had known my father from Rotary lunches, told me she had always suspected Mark was taking credit for technical work he didn't understand. The Rotary bioreactors were installed on schedule, my software algorithm humming along inside the controllers, and the project succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. I eventually licensed the technology to other municipalities, from Ann Arbor to Madison, and the royalties built a quiet, steady income that meant I never had to calibrate another valve stem unless I wanted to. Mark was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, plus 5 years of supervised release, and the court ordered restitution of nearly $200,000 for the fraudulent loan and legal fees. Karen got 18 months, suspended to 5 years of intensive probation after she agreed to testify against Mark, but her assets were seized to partially satisfy the restitution order. The German sedan was repossessed, the granite countertop and designer chairs auctioned off. I heard she now lives in a rented studio apartment near the interstate and works at a call center, though I don't waste time thinking about her. I renamed the company Composted Lies Inc. because I wanted the world to know exactly what had grown out of that rot. The system is still sold under that banner, and every installation manual includes a foreword that reads, "Integrity is the most durable alloy." True to my plan, I set up a recurring, automated donation schedule with the International Association of Document Examiners, a nonprofit that trains forensic analysts to detect forgery and provides pro bono services to fraud victims. Every single check, generated quarterly by my business account, bears a notation on the memo line. Inspirational Fraudster of the Year, Mark Rifkin. I also sent them a framed photocopy of his mugshot, pinned next to the original forged document, which they now use in their training seminars as a textbook example of a poorly executed forgery. I once received a thank you note from the association's president, who said the story had inspired a junior analyst to catch $1 million real estate fraud. My father's quiet engineering mind had designed the ultimate dead man's switch, a lockbox of legal evidence that only I could unlock, and I only had to be brave enough to turn the key. He taught me that integrity isn't just a word you put on blueprints. It's the foundation you build on so that when the ground shifts, your structure holds. Family can be a beautiful gift or a carefully concealed liability, and you owe it to yourself to read the fine print on both. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you believe that justice can be engineered one piece of evidence at a time, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell. I'll be here with another story soon.